In the spring of 2025, the United States launched the most aggressive trade offensive against a Democratic ally in modern history. A blanket 25% tariff on Canadian goods, 50% on Canadian steel and aluminum, threats of annexation, repeated public suggestions that Canada should become the 51st American state. The explicit expectation, built into the White House's strategic calculation, that Canada, smaller, economically integrated, dependent on American market access for 3/4 of its exports, would fold within weeks. Canada did not fold, and what happened next produced one of the most instructive case studies in international political economy that we have seen in the past decade. A case study about the limits of economic coercion, about what happens when the world's largest economy miscalculates its leverage, about the difference between the size of an economy and the discipline of the people running it. On May 6, 2025, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked into the Oval Office for his first bilateral meeting with Donald Trump. He told the president directly, "Canada is not for sale and never will be." Trump told reporters that same day that nothing Carney could say would persuade him to lift the tariffs. By the time Carney left Washington, the tone of the entire trade confrontation had measurably shifted. I have gone through the verified economic data, the institutional assessments from the Bank of Canada, RBC Economics, the Peterson Institute, CEPR, and the documented market responses to every phase of this trade war. What emerges is not the story of a dramatic 4-minute surrender. That framing is both inaccurate and analytically useless. What emerges is a far more important story about how bond markets, currency markets, and democratic legitimacy impose discipline on even the largest economies in the world. Welcome to Global Faultlines. This is the story the finance channels are getting wrong. Let us begin with the economic structure of this relationship, because understanding what was at stake requires precision most coverage has not provided. The United States and Canada share the world's largest bilateral trading relationship. In 2024, the United States exported $349.4 billion worth of goods to Canada, making Canada the single largest destination for American exports on Earth. Total bilateral trade exceeds $440 billion annually. Canada accounts for 14% of all U.S. trade. The integration is structural. A single automobile manufactured in the United States or Canada typically crosses the border multiple times during its production cycle, components moving between facilities in Michigan, Ontario, and elsewhere before the finished vehicle rolls off the line. The U.S. auto industry is not separate from the Canadian auto industry. It is the same industry operating across an integrated continental production system built over 3 decades under NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA, a deal Trump himself negotiated and signed in his first term. When a 25% tariff is applied at every border crossing in that production cycle, the cost impact compounds. Industry analysts estimated total auto sector tariff exposure at over $100 billion annually if fully sustained. General Motors CEO Mary Barra told CNN that tariffs would cost her company between $4 billion and $5 billion in 2026 alone. Ford suspended its entire 2025 financial guidance, saying tariff uncertainty made forward projections impossible. These were the CEOs of America's flagship manufacturing companies telling markets they could not run their businesses under the new trade regime. Canada's response was not to plead for relief. It was to retaliate. Ottawa announced 25% counter-tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods immediately, escalating within 3 weeks to retaliatory measures covering $155 billion in U.S. imports. Canadian provinces began implementing Buy Canadian procurement policies. Provincial governments removed American alcohol from government-run liquor stores. RBC Economics documented that Canadians returning from the United States declined 25% year-over-year through 2025. Canada's merchandise exports to non-U.S. economies grew 17% year-over-year in the 12 months to January 2026, a documented diversification away from American market dependence that will have long-term structural consequences for the bilateral relationship. The United States had assumed Canada would have no choice but to absorb the pressure. That assumption failed to account for who was leading Canada. Mark Carney is not a politician who became an economist. He is an economist who became a politician, and the distinction matters enormously. Carney served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. He then served as governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, managing two of the world's 7 major central banks through the worst financial crises in decades. He navigated Canada through the 2008 global financial crisis. He managed Britain's monetary policy through the economic turbulence of Brexit. He has sat across from more complex financial emergencies than most heads of government will encounter in a lifetime. When Carney won Canada's federal election on April 28, 2025, 2 days after his first White House visit, he did so on an explicit platform of firmness toward American trade pressure. His victory gave him a fresh Democratic mandate that made further White House pressure not just economically costly, but politically counterproductive. As CNN noted in its May 2025 analysis, Trump's aggressive tariff campaign had inadvertently helped Carney consolidate political power. The trade war that was supposed to weaken Canada had strengthened its government's Democratic mandate to resist. Economic coercion is most effective against isolated, institutionally weak governments with limited public support. It is least effective against newly elected governments with fresh mandates, strong institutional frameworks, and clear public backing for resistance. Canada had all three. By the time of Carney's second White House visit in October 2025, Trump was calling him a world-class leader and a tough negotiator, saying Canada would walk away very happy. Trump even told reporters, "I think he's a great prime minister. He could represent me anytime." Carney's response was to make a writing gesture and tell the assembled press, "Write that down." That exchange between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada, 6 months into the most aggressive bilateral trade war in modern history, captured the shift precisely. The power dynamic had moved. Here's the part of the story that most coverage has entirely missed, and it carries the most important lessons for anyone tracking global power dynamics. The trade war did not just cost Canada, it cost the United States, in real, measurable, market-verified terms. In the week of March 7, 2025, as the first major tariff package on Canadian and Mexican goods took effect, the US dollar index fell 4.2%. That was the steepest single-week dollar decline since the 2008 global financial crisis. By March 13th, the dollar had fallen more than 5.5% from its mid-January high. By the first week of April, it had reached a 3-year low against the euro. Dollar weakness is not simply an exchange rate inconvenience. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency, the foundation on which the entire global financial system rests. When the dollar weakens alongside rising treasury yields, which is precisely what happened in April 2025, it generates a specific and alarming signal. Under normal conditions, dollar weakness should cause yields to fall because investors seek bonds as safe haven assets when growth slows. When yields rise simultaneously with dollar weakness, it indicates that foreign holders are selling U.S. Treasury bonds, reducing exposure to American debt rather than increasing it. According to the documented timeline of the 2025 trade war, confirmed by multiple market analyses, on April 10, 2025, the S&P 500 dropped approximately 15% from its February peak, while long-term Treasury bonds faced significant simultaneous selling pressure. The Economist described Trump's trade policymaking as whimsical and arbitrary, noting that social media had become the vehicle for announcing decisions that even the president's own advisors could not predict. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index plunged to 50.8 on April 11th, the second lowest reading since records began in 1952. The U.S. trade deficit hit a record $140.5 billion in March 2025. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell publicly warned that tariffs created a dual mandate conflict, simultaneously pushing inflation higher while slowing growth. That combination is the definition of stagflation. The last time America experienced serious stagflation was the 1970s oil crisis, an era of double-digit inflation, unemployment above 10%, and a devastating recession that required the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker to raise interest rates to 20% to correct. Academic modeling from CEPR projected that under sustained tariffs with full retaliation, U.S. real GDP would fall approximately 1 to 4%, while real wages declined 1.4%. The National Retail Federation estimated the tariff burden on American consumers at $78 billion annually, with the average American household absorbing approximately $1,200 in additional annual costs. This is not pain that falls on foreign countries. Tariffs are paid by importing American companies, which pass the cost to American consumers. The economic literature on this point is unanimous across the political spectrum. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, a former hedge fund manager, had publicly stated that bringing 10-year Treasury yields down was a key policy priority. A trade war that pushed yields up directly contradicted that stated objective. The internal policy contradiction was visible and significant. Let us now examine what this trade confrontation revealed about the architecture of global economic power, because this is the analytical dimension that Global Faultlines exists to surface. The conventional assumption embedded in the White House's trade war strategy was that economic size equals economic leverage. The United States has a GDP of approximately $28 trillion. Canada's GDP is approximately $2.2 trillion. On that measure, the leverage ratio appears overwhelming. But economic size and economic leverage are not the same thing. Canada supplies critical inputs to American industry that cannot be rapidly replaced from alternative sources. Aluminum, steel, softwood lumber, energy, and auto components that are structurally integrated into American manufacturing. Canada is not simply a customer for American products. It is a component of American productive capacity. When you place tariffs on a supplier that is structurally integrated into your own production system, you are not punishing a foreign country. You are taxing your own manufacturers, your own car buyers, your own construction industry, and your own energy infrastructure. The Peterson Institute confirmed this. The proposed 25% tariffs on Canadian imports could lower Canadian GDP by 1.25% by 2027. But they would simultaneously reduce U.S. GDP by approximately 1% and real wages by 1.4% by 2028, according to CEPR modeling. A trade war against a deeply integrated partner is, in economic terms, largely a trade war against yourself. Canada understood this. Carney, with his central banking background, understood it with precision. And crucially, bond markets understood it too. When the dollar fell 4.2% in a single week, and Treasury bonds faced simultaneous selling pressure, it was the bond market imposing discipline on a policy the political system was refusing to correct. This is the mechanism that Mark Carney, as a former governor of 2 central banks, understood better than almost anyone in the room. Governments can resist political pressure. They cannot resist bond markets indefinitely. 1 year after the trade war's most acute phase, RBC Economics published a documented assessment of the outcomes. Canada posted its first per capita GDP increase in 3 years in 2025. The unemployment rate moved broadly sideways. Consumer confidence had plunged in spring, but household spending held up. Net foreign direct investment into Canada was positive for the first time in more than a decade. Canada's exports to non-American markets grew 17% year over year, the beginning of a structural diversification that reduces future vulnerability to American trade pressure. The United States, meanwhile, recorded a record trade deficit. Its dollar reached multi-year lows. Consumer confidence hit generational lows. Its largest automakers suspended guidance and warned of multi-billion-dollar cost increases. Its bond market flashed distress signals simultaneously with currency weakness, a combination that professional fixed-income analysts globally described as genuinely alarming. The Economist's verdict was precise. Trump had replaced a century of stable trading relations with policymaking that was whimsical and arbitrary. Neither country won a clean victory in this confrontation. Both economies absorbed real damage. As of October 2025, Carney and Trump had held 2 White House meetings. No comprehensive tariff deal had been reached. The trade war had been partially managed but not resolved. Canada had made some concessions, dropping certain counter-tariffs and scrapping a digital services tax on American tech companies. The United States had moderated its rhetoric without formally reversing its tariff posture. But the strategic picture is clear. The country that launched the most aggressive trade offensive against a democratic ally in modern history did not achieve its stated objectives. Canada did not fold. It did not make fundamental concessions under pressure. Its prime minister entered the Oval Office and told the President of the United States that his country was not for sale, and left with his position intact, his mandate strengthened, and his opponent calling him a world-class leader 6 months later. The bond markets told the real story, and the real story is that trade wars are not won by the largest economy. They are won by the most disciplined one. Here's the strategic picture that Global Faultlines exists to provide. What we witnessed in the US-Canada trade confrontation of 2025 is a template, not just for North American trade relations, but for how global power dynamics operate in the 21st century. Economic coercion works on weak, isolated, institutionally fragile states. It does not work on deeply integrated partners with institutional strength, fresh democratic mandates, and leaders who understand how bond markets impose discipline on governments that politics refuses to correct. The world's major economies are watching this template carefully. The European Union, China, Japan, Australia. Each is drawing its own conclusions about the reliability of American trade commitments and the tools available to resist American economic pressure. The dollar's reserve currency status, the foundation of American financial power globally, is not damaged by any single episode, but it is eroded by repeated episodes of policy unpredictability that cause foreign holders of American debt to quietly reduce their exposure. That is a slow process. It does not produce a single dramatic headline. But in the data, in the treasury yield movements, in the dollar index, in the foreign holdings of American bonds, the signal is there. Canada's central banker walked into the Oval Office and demonstrated something that financial markets have been calculating for decades, that in the global economy, credibility, institutional strength, and democratic legitimacy are forms of leverage that no tariff can overcome. That is what this trade war actually revealed. And it is precisely the kind of structural shift that Global Faultlines tracks, the forces that reshape global power long before they become obvious to the wider world. If today's analysis gave you a clearer picture of how global economic power actually works, share it, subscribe, come back. This is Global Faultlines. See beyond the headlines.